Picture this. A man who once had a name but no longer a place. A man who lived outside the circle of firelight, where people laugh and share bread. His name was Montu, the lone hunter. To the village, he was a shadow. Someone spoken of with distrust. A man broken by grief and shame. For years he wandered in the forest, carrying his sorrow like a wound that never closed, living with silence as his only companion. And yet, fate always finds a way to disturb silence. On one storm-soaked morning, the forest did not speak with birds or wind, but with a scream. Sharp, desperate, human. Montu froze, his instincts sharpened. It was not the cry of an animal, nor the call of hunters. It was the cry of a woman in pain, a cry that clawed through the storm and lodged in his chest. Following the sound, he found her, a woman collapsed in the mud, heavy with child, her breath ragged, her body trembling on the edge of life and death. Her eyes half closed, lips cracked, fists digging into earth as though it might hold her upright. A stranger, a mother alone, and Montu, the man who had once lost his wife and child, now stood before the chance he was denied years ago. For a heartbeat, the old scars burned. His own wife's labor had ended in blood and silence, leaving him with guilt deeper than the river, and a name spat like an insult. Now fate dared to test him again. Walk away and carry another ghost, or stay and risk being cursed all over? Montu did not think, he acted. He lifted her into his arms and carried her through the storm to his cave, the only place he still called his own. Inside, the fire sputtered weakly, giving more smoke than warmth. He laid her on his goatskin bed, the only softness he owned. The storm outside made the forest shake like a war drum, while inside Montu faced a different kind of battle. The scent of rain mixed with sweat and blood, with memories that stabbed him like knives. He had never helped bring life into the world. Not his own child, not anyone's. When his wife cried out years ago, fate was faster and crueler than his hands. It stole them both, leaving him with silence instead of laughter. And now, staring at this stranger, the past returned, sharp and merciless. The woman groaned, eyes squeezed shut, knuckles clutching clumps of mud as though they were lifelines. Montu felt fear pressing in, but not fear of death, fear of failing again. He could not let her die. That much he knew. He soaked a cloth in his only jar of water and wiped her face, speaking not words of comfort, but words that told her she wasn't alone. His voice, cracked from years of silence, carried something stronger than hope. Presence. Time bent in that cave. Hours passed like moments, and moments stretched into eternities. By the time the storm broke and the sun returned, her scream split the silence like thunder. Montu moved with urgency, boiling water, setting aside the knife his father once used, now heated over flame. His hands trembled, not in fear, but with reverence, as if he stood before something holy. The woman's eyes met his, heavy with exhaustion, and something inside Montu broke. It wasn't only she giving birth, he was too. He was dragging from the shadows a part of himself buried with his lost family. Her final scream came, and then silence. The child did not cry. The silence stretched like a noose. Montu cut the cord, lifted the tiny body, and breathed life across its face. Then came the sound. A cry sharp and alive, so real that even the birds in the forest stopped to listen. It was as if the earth itself had paused to hear. Montu's heart shuddered, but no tears fell. He tore strips from his own shirt to clean the child, wrapped the baby in his blanket, and placed it on the mother's chest. She was battered, bleeding, but alive. On her face flickered a smile, faint, fragile, like someone who finally sees light after endless night. In that instant, Montu understood. He hadn't only helped bring life. He had helped bring justice, forgiveness, and faith back into a place where they had long been absent. He sat silently by her side, listening to the baby's small sounds and the wind brushing stone. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a fugitive. He felt needed. He felt whole. The forest, once the shelter of his pain, now became a witness to his quiet redemption. The dawn crept through the cave's mouth, lighting the faces of mother and child in gold. Nature itself bowed to the miracle, a miracle that began in screams but ended in silence. The baby slept peacefully, pressed against his mother's chest. The woman, though weak, kept her eyes open, watching, guarding, as if her life depended on it. Montu sat at the cave's entrance, slowly sharpening his blade. Not from need, but from habit. From time to time he looked back, afraid that if he blinked, the fragile scene would vanish. She had not yet spoken her name, nor where she came from. Only nodded once in thanks and fell quiet again. But it was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of secrets too heavy to spill. By the next morning she found her voice. In a hoarse whisper, holding her child tightly, she said, "This one is a miracle." She explained nothing more. But the way she looked at her child was like someone gazing at a prophecy. Montu saw it too. Something in her tone spoke not just of affection, but survival. When she finally slept, Montu noticed the scar on her arm, a crescent mark he remembered from long ago, a tribal seal, the sign of women cast out from their bloodlines. Suddenly he knew. She wasn't merely a lost soul. She was fleeing something much greater. Later, when she woke and grabbed his hand with surprising strength, she whispered almost like a prayer, "Don't tell them who I am." Montu nodded without a word. He was not a man who forced truth. He had learned some things, like forgiveness, like birth, demand time. Days passed, and their bond grew in silence. He hunted, she healed him with herbs. They survived. But Montu saw the fear in her eyes. Fear not born of the forest, but of something still chasing her. Slowly the truth unfolded. She had been promised to a powerful man, feared and respected, and the child was not born of love. She fell silent after confessing, but Montu's gaze hardened into a shield. He understood. She did not need questions. She needed someone who would not run. And then came the revelation. The baby's birthmark. The spiral identical to the one he had seen long ago on the illegitimate son of the village chief. The miracle, the escape, the silence, the fear. It all had a name. This child carried royal blood, and with it, danger. Montu looked at the baby and did not just see a child. He saw a promise, a reckoning, and a chance to make peace with the past that haunted him. Perhaps he had not found this woman by accident. Perhaps fate had found him. 7 days passed. Her fever grew, her strength faltered, and Montu knew he could no longer hide them. To save her and the child, he would have to return to the very place that had cast him out, a village that once branded him coward, liar, and unworthy. He had not been formally exiled, but no one had ever called him back, until now. With the baby in his arms and the fading woman on his back, Montu stepped from the shadows toward the village he had abandoned. Each step was a defiance of the past. Each step was a return to wounds that had never healed. The village entrance stood before him. 2 crossed logs with scraps of cloth tied like warnings, guarded by young boys learning to fight with wooden spears, and when they saw him, the boys dropped their weapons. Their wide eyes held not just surprise, but fear, memory, judgments reborn. Montu said nothing. He simply walked straight ahead, head held high. The woman trembled on his back, the baby wrapped in cloth against his chest. The walk felt like a ritual, and maybe it was. The first villagers stepped out of their homes. They abandoned pots on the fire, left clothes half-pinned 2 lines. Voices faded, and now only the sound of his footsteps on the hard-packed earth could be heard. Each step a reckoning, each gaze thrown at him a reminder of when he had been left behind as they passed through the central square. The villager's eldest elder rose from her straw chair, leaning against the wall of the temple of the ancestors. It was Mother, aka the voice of the dead, who had witnessed more births and burials than anyone alive. Her eyes met Montus with severity. Then she spat on the ground, an ancient gesture reserved for those who defiled the sacred. But he didn't stop. He walked straight to the healer's house, didn't knock, entered with the woman in his arms and laid her on the cleanest mat. The healer, a thin man with nimble hands, began to object. But one look from Mu and silence returned. It was as if the man they had all forgotten had returned with the weight of someone who'd faced true pain. The village was in shock. No one understood. Some whispered it was madness. Others that he had kidnapped the woman. A few remembered the accusations of years past. Seeds of suspicion began to sprout like weeds. But there were also those who watched in silence, who sensed something larger was unfolding. Something yet unnamed that night. No drums played. No dancing took place. Children were brought inside early, and in the mutest families whispered, "He's back with a woman, with a child. Is it his? Is this another mistake?" Meanwhile, Mu sat outside the healer's hut. He didn't eat, didn't speak. He just stayed there guarding, protecting as if he knew this wasn't over. The next morning, the woman awoke, weak but alive. When she realized where she was, she tried to rise in panic. Montu entered and held her hand firmly, said, "Only, you're safe. They won't touch you." And for the first time she cried, not from pain, but from something older. Maybe relief, maybe memory. The baby was taken to the temple to be presented to the spirits, as tradition demanded. But there was resistance. Some elders said it was an offense that a man like Montu, tainted and disgraced, could not bring a child into the realm of Theansters. But the healer's voice cut through. The child did not choose who carries him, but he chose where to be born. And so before the whole village, the child was lifted into the sunlight. Small, strong, with eyes that burned with an untold story. The woman, still seated, did not reveal her name. She only nodded when asked if she wished to stay. And Montu, for the first time since his return, spoke aloud. She will stay, and if anyone tries to take her, they'll have to go through me. What was witnessed in that moment was not just a return. It was a rupture, a challenge to traditions that protect the powerful and silence the wronged. Because in that village, no one had ever dared come back like that, carrying a new life in their arms, with truth pulsing in their eyes. And though no one spoke it aloud, all knew something had changed. And what began as a birth in the forest was now the rebirth of the village itself. Whether it was ready or not, the village seemed suspended in a time of waiting. Life continued as usual. Corn being pounded in the stone grinders, roosters fighting in the yards, children chasing wooden wheels through the dust. But something in the air had shifted. It wasn't peace, it was tension. Vigilance, as if everyone sensed that a forgotten story was about to rise again and collect what had been left unpaid. The woman, still without a name, remained resting, cared for by the healer, fed by the hands of older women who, despite their suspicions, couldn't turn their backs. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her words were like dry leaves blown by the wind, fragile but echoing. The baby was growing fast, strong. The mark on his leg, that spiral symbol, could no longer be hidden. Montu knew that Mark had the power to reopen wounds. And that's exactly what happened. One night, under a sky that felt lower than usual, she had a nightmare. She screamed aloud, sobbing, soaked in sweat, twisting on her mat. Montu rushed in. He held her in his arms, trying to soothe her. And in the midst of that panic, among confused words and broken phrases, she whispered a name that silenced even they bots in the cave. And Babai was the name of the village chief. The word dropped like a stone in the middle of a river. Montu froze. The woman fell back into exhausted sleep, but the name had been spoken, and with it, everything began to shift. The next morning, while she still slept, Montu walked to the riverbank. He sat there for hours, remembering the day his world collapsed, the day he was wrongly accused of touching a girl promised to the chief. He remembered the trial, the eyes that turned away, his mother's shame, the solitude that followed. But now everything felt different. The woman he had saved, who had trusted her life and her child to his hands, had spoken the name of the same man who had cast him out, the same man who smiled before the people and hidleys behind the staff of power. Montu returned to the healer. He asked to speak with Elder Ikaya. She resisted but agreed. They sat beneath the fig tree of council where only matters of grave importance were discussed. He told her everything. The encounter in the forest, the birth, the mark, the whispered name, and finally the symbol on the child's leg. The elder said nothing for a long time. She simply stared at the ground as if listening to the dead beneath it. Then she raised her eyes and said, "That mark. I've seen it before on another boy. One the chief denied was his." Her calm words thundered through Montu's consciousness. It wasn't just about him. It was about what the village had chosen to silence for years. That baby was living proof of a cycle of abuse and lies. Soon the whispers began. Someone had heard. Someone had told. Rumors spread that the woman from the forest had ties to the chief, that she had been promised to him, and discarded that the baby was his blood. When the chief heard the rumors, he summoned the elders. He demanded Mantu be questioned, claimed it was all lies, that people were trying to stain his honor. But the truth had already taken root. During the gathering at the temple before the full council, Montu did not back down. He said he was not afraid, that the truth already had a name, a face, and the cry of a child. And then before them all, he revealed the mark on the baby's leg. The chief turned pale, tried to laugh it off, to dismiss it, claimed marks appeared on any skin, but no one laughed. One of the oldest elders stood and said that mark is a story, and the story is returning. The woman, though still weak, was brought in. When she saw the chief, her eyes filled with rage and sorrow. But she didn't scream. She didn't kneel. She simply said, "You know who I am. And you know what, you dear." The chief tried to deny it, tried to blame Montu, said it was a conspiracy, but his words no longer carried the same weight. Something had shifted in the hearts of the people. Fear began to give way to memory. And so the old lie, the one buried in threats, silence, and pretense, began to crack. Because no matter how deep the earth hides it, truth always grows back. And on that day, it rose in the cry of a child, in the mark on skin, in a name whispered by a woman no one had wanted to hear. And for the first time in many years, Montu was no longer the accused. He was the witness to something the world tried to forget. But that fate, with its sharp turns and deep wounds, had made sure to remember. The sun was setting when Montu returned to the makeshift hut by the river where he had chosen to settle since his reluctant return to the village. The woman rested with the baby nestled against her chest. There was a silence there, not empty but thick like an old lament. Mu walked slowly to the shadow of the fig tree, sat on the ground, and let his eyes rest on the flowing water. He thought about everything, the name she had whispered, the child's mark, the woman's fear, but what hurt most was the thing no one could see: the boy he himself had lost. It was a memory Mu had avoided for years. The tiny body he had buried with his own hands, wrapped in a simple cloth beneath a tree at the forest's edge. It was a boy born and died on the same night. No one cared to know his name. His wife hadn't survived the birth. And Montu, too, young to understand the cruelty of the world, was accused of negligence, of not having done enough. The pain came with the shame. Then came the exile, the silence, and the burden of carrying a guilt that was never his dot. Now here he was with another baby in his arms, as if time had folded back to give him a second chance. The woman slept deeply, exhausted from days of fear and tension. The baby began to cry. Mu got up, cradled the child gently, and searched for something to feed him. He found the wooden bowl of goat's milk warmed by the fire, the same technique his mother had taught him back when he was still someone's son, not just the hunter of the forest. He sat down and fed the baby. The tiny eyes alert searched for his. It was as if the child knew, as if he recognized in that man the pain, the abandonment, the thirst for justice yet unfulfilled. Montu held the bowl in one hand and the baby in the other. And when he finished, something rose from his gut to his chest, and from his chest to his eyes. A tear fell, then another. For the second time in his life, he cried. But it wasn't just sadness. It was gratitude. It was healing. The next morning, something shifted. The woman woke and called him father. It wasn't a slip, nor a passing word. It was recognition, surrender. She had seen in Mu's eyes the figure who would protect that child. Even if the world collapsed around them, he tried to object. Said it wasn't his place, that it wasn't his blood. But she only took his hand and answered, "You were the first man who didn't silence me, who looked at me with truth." That's enough. Those words stayed with him all day. Montu didn't believe in titles, in honors, in glory. But in that moment, it was as if his soul had been given a new name. Not by others, but by himself. He was no longer just the hunter who fled from the shadows of the past. He was now the one who dared to carry a life. And that was more powerful than any redemption he could have imagined. But peace didn't last long. That night, as the fire crackled low and the village slept, hurried footsteps crossed the forest. A shadow approached the hut. Montu felt it. He grabbed his short spear and stepped outside. He found the intruder standing in the dark. A young man with an arrogant expression, shoulders squared, voice hiding fear. It was the chief's bastard son, the one who also bore the mark. And now he had come for the baby. "That child cannot live," he said. "Hell ruin everything." Montu didn't speak. He raised his spear. The young man stepped back, tried to reason, said the chief was furious that he wouldn't allow such shame to grow, that people would start asking questions, digging too deep, said the woman was dangerous, that she brought chaos, that she should have died in the forest. But Montu didn't move. Hess stared at him like one star at a past that refuses to die. And then with a steady voice he said, "You're too late. She's already been born, and now she's not alone." The young man hesitated, huffed, and vanished into the forest. But the message had been delivered. What once was secret was now a threat. When Muntu returned to the hut, he found the woman standing, the baby in her arms, eyes wet, but steady. She had heard everything, and for the first time, she allowed herself to speak. "They will try to silence us like before, but this time, someone stayed." In that moment, Mu understood he wasn't just protecting a baby. He was guarding an ancient truth, a scream smothered across generations. And more importantly, he was finally freeing the man. The world had tried to kill inside him. The forest was no longer a refuge of pain. It was now the place where his soul had begun at last to heal. The next dawn carried with it a heavy stillness. The ancestral temple bells did not ring. The women did not sing while fetching water. The men gathered earlier than usual, but not to hunt. It was as if the entire village held its breath, bracing for something no one dared name. The air felt ceremonial yet tense, and at the center of it all, once again stood Mu, the hunter who had returned. Now, not only with a woman in his arms, but with the truth on his back. The chief had called for an emergency council meeting. He claimed his honor was under attack, that dangerous rumors were spreading, that a stranger taken in by a man with a stained past now dared question the bloodline of his house. He demanded justice, but the people wanted more than words. They wanted to see. They wanted to hear. The village square was chosen as the stage. It would not be an official trial that would require rituals and days of preparation, but it would be what it always had been, a trial through the eyes of the people. The woman was brought into the square on a wooden chair draped in cloth, still weak, but with eyes full of truth. She held the baby in her lap like a living shield. She didn't speak right away. She scanned the crowd, seeing unfamiliar faces and others pretending not to recognize her. When the chief arrived, flanked by his sons, golden necklaces, and a wife in silent detachment, a chill swept through the village. Datyao, the elders sat in a circle. The healer was among them. Montu stood beside the woman, his gaze locked forward. He wasn't the accused, but he wasn't free either. He was bound to that story as if it were one of his own bones. The chief spoke first. He claimed they were victims of a conspiracy, that the woman was unstable, maybe even cursed, that Montu, bitter from his past, had found a way to get revenge, that the child was a fabrication, a filthy scheme against his leadership. But no one applauded. No one answered. Then the woman spoke. Her voice was low but steady. She said her name unknown to many, but echoing in the ears of the elders. She revealed herself to be the rejected daughter of a tribal leader, one who had been betrayed by the very council that years ago supported Inbei. She said she was promised in marriage to seal alliances, but refused to be traded like coin. She ran, she was hunted, and eventually she was violated. She spoke without hatred, only with the strength of someone who has decided to stay silent no longer. She lifted the baby and revealed the mark, looked straight into the chief's eyes and said, "He bears your mark, but he will not inherit your cowardice." Mu stood still. The people murmured. Some looked down. Others stared at the chief as if seeing him for the first time. The chief smirked. "This is conspiracy. This is theater," he said, but no one laughed. Then Elder Achaia stood, the woman who never took sides, who only observed. She walked slowly to the center of the square, looked at the baby, then at the woman. She touched the mark on the child's skin and murmured something no one understood, then turned to the crowd and said, "This story has been told before and buried." And the silence broke. 3 women stood, each with her head covered, their shoulders heavy with time, and one by one they told old stories of when they too had been silenced. Not with words, but with gestures, with stares, with threats, all pointed to the same name, Inbei. That was enough. The crowd didn't shout, didn't rush forward, but they didn't obey either. For the first time, they did not bow. The chief's wife removed her necklace, let it fall onto the beaten earth. Her eyes said everything. "Muinti, you stood tall." The baby whimpered softly. The woman held him tightly. The truth had finally emerged from the cave where it had long been buried. And the trial ended like that, without a verdict, without formal punishment, but with something far more powerful. The silence of a community that had finally seen, heard, and above all felt. It was the end of a lie and the beginning of something still being born. In the village, every night had its own sound. The wind rustling through the leaves, the soft shuffle of sandals on dry earth, the murmur of prayers whispered in backyards. But that night, no drums played, no fires were lit in the dancing squares. The children were put to bed before the last star appeared. The dogs howled differently, and the elders, even without saying a word, knew the world as they knew it had changed. The chief Inbei did not leave his house. The doors were locked, the windows shut. He gave no orders, summoned no counsel, did not speak his name aloud. For the first time in years, his silence was fear. Not fear of losing power, but of finally being seen for who he truly was. At the center of the village, Elder A lit a small fire. It was tradition that when something grave touched the spirit of the people, the elders would gather for a vigil. But that night, no formal invitation was given. Still the people came one by one carrying silence, tearful eyes, and the feeling that something needed healing not only in others, but within themselves. Montu arrived with the woman and the baby. He was not escorted. He was not announced. He simply appeared like a sign that truth no longer hid. The people parted, giving him space, not out of fear but out of respect. In his steps, there was a quiet strength that did not impose itself but said, "I have returned whole." Around the fire, murmurs gave way to listening. And when Elder Eka raised her hand, all fell silent. She did not shout. She gave no speech. She simply said, "This night is for those who have carried silence too long. It is time to speak." Then the unexpected happened. 3 women, once invisible in the village, stood up. One was the midwife who had never become a mother. The second, the fisherman's daughter, known for her sadness. The third, the potter's widow, always dressed in black. None of them had ever spoken of what they knew, but now before the fire they chose to break time. They told stories with similar names. The midwife said she had been touched against her will on a rainy night, and when she spoke up she was accused of seduction. The fisherman's daughter revealed the chief would summon her for spiritual talks when she was just 12. The potter's widow confessed she lost her husband after he tried to denounce abuses he had witnessed, and all of them directly or indirectly carried Mbe's shadow. No one interrupted them. No one looked away. That night was not for defense. It was for revelation. The chief did not appear, but his absence screamed, and slowly the people began to understand. Power may wear necklaces and hold staffs, but truth it bears scars. Then the woman, the one who arrived, broken, bleeding in the forest, rose with the baby in her arms. She walked to the fire. The flames lit her face, and her voice, though soft, beat like a drum straight to the heart. My name is Io. I was given as an offering, hunted, violated, but not destroyed. This child is a seed, and seeds do not obey. They grow. Silence. Dot. After that, no one asked for explanations. No one demanded proof. The truth had already been planted. Elder Eka looked at Mantu and said, "She broke the chain. But you were the one who stood still to hold the blade." People began to move. Some knelt, others wept, and many simply held their children tighter. It wasn't a night of celebration. It was a night of reckoning. A night when the masks fell and the ancestral spirit blew once more through the village. The drums were silent, but in that silence the people's hearts beat louder than ever. Because sometimes sound must retreat so truth can speak. And that night it did, in the voice of a woman, in the eyes of a child, in the silence of a hunter who, without intending to, became the guardian of all the pain no one dared to name. The next morning, the wind blew differently. It carried not dust but memory. The village woke slowly, as if time itself had lost its urgency. Eyes were swollen, not from sleep, but from everything seen and spoken the night before. It was as if words still hovered above the thatched rooftops, looking for a place to land in hearts that had long refused to feel. The people gathered once more in the central square, not by command of the chief, but by impulse of the soul, as if something called to them, as if they knew, even without knowing that the day would bring more than repair. It would bring rebirth. Ao arrived with steady steps. She was no longer the woman who fell in the forest, nor the fugitive from an imposed past. She carried her son in her arms, like one who presents a new oracle to the world. The cloth she wore was simple, but there was dignity in every fold. Atherside, MTO, not as her escort but as her root. His presence was that of a tree, firm, silent, impossible to ignore. The circle formed naturally. Men, women, elders, children, all eyes fixed on that small body now about to be named. It was tradition for names to be given by an elder or by a blood relative. But this child was different. His birth had broken rules. His existence challenged structures. He was the seed of another truth. Elder Eka, with a staff older than most present, stepped forward. She performed no ceremony. She simply pointed to the boy and said, "Nzinga." The name cut through the crowd like sunlight-piercing clouds. Some recognized it, others simply felt it. "Nzinga," she repeated. "The one who breaks the chain, who does not inherit shame, but SW's the new." Ao wept, not from pain, but as if in that name she found not only redemption but justice. Montu took the baby in his arms, lifted him with both hands, and held him to the sky. There were no drums, but the wind, the leaves, and the hushed voices woo a silent music that noon would ever forget. But the ceremony still held another revelation. Ao stepped toward the center where the leadership staff was planted in a mound of earth. The symbol of power, of tradition, of the order that had ruled the village for generations. She looked around and said, "My father was betrayed by this council, his name erased, his bloodline denied. I am his daughter, and through blood and pain I carry his honor." Murmurs rose. The chief, hidden in his home, knew he could no longer silence the voice now rising. She needed no more proof. Her story, her body, her child, they were proof enough. That, and then something even more unexpected happened. Elder Eka turned to MTO. She looked him up and down, not with judgment, but with reverence, and she said, "For years we left you outside, called you cursed, unworthy. But it was you who opened your arms when all others turned their backs. It was you who heard the cry the forest tried to bury." The crowd fell silent. She continued, "Therefore, before the living and the dead, the ancestors and those yet to come, we declare your new name, guardian of the forgotten truth." Montu did not cry. He did not smile. He simply bowed his head, as one who receives not a tribute but a task, and for him that was enough. The village bowed, not as subjects, but as children before a new hope. That day there was no feast, but there was healing. The birth of Nzinga was not just the birth of a child. It was the birth of a new time of a community that wounded chose to face its scars, that marked by shame dared to begin again. And Mu, the man who once hunted silence, now guarded, voices Heflu without wings. He carried the honor of one who had lost everything, and yet still had the courage to reach out a hand. Because in the world of the living and the ancestors, few are more respected than the one who chooses to protect, even when no one asked him to. The days that followed were like the silence after a great storm. The village seemed to breathe more slowly. Smiles returned to the children's faces, and the eyes of the elders, though still heavy, no longer avoided the square, and Zinga's name was whispered with reverence. Ao, now recognized as the forsaken daughter of a betrayed leader, had become a symbol of something greater than herself, a symbol of the truth that, though delayed, always finds its way. And Montu was no longer just the hunter. He was the man who, without meaning to, had helped lift the spirit of the people. But not all wounds had been washed clean. Mbe, the fallen chief, no longer ruled the village. Officially, he had not been deposed, but in practice his power had evaporated. His sons avoided the square, and his wife, the one who had removed her necklace and let it fall to the dirt, now moved like a shadow between the gardens, gathering roots to make her own medicines. The throne still stood, but it was empty because nobody can sustain a power that the heart no longer recognizes. It was on a clear morning that he appeared. Mbe walked to the center of the village wearing an expression that held no arrogance. In truth, it held nothing. It was a man stripped of power, dressed only in the weight of time. Behind him, two men carried baskets, one filled with gold coins, the other with ancient jewelry. Ahead of him, a boy held a rope tied to 3 goats. The people gathered cautiously. O arrived, Nzinga in her arms. Montu stood beside her as always. Elder Eka watched from a distance. Everyone wanted to know what he would say, but no one rushed. Mbe stopped in front of Ao. His eyes were lowered, his voice unlike any other time. No command, no trick, no armor. If there is any worth left in my word, he said, I come here to ask forgiveness for what I did, for what I denied, and for what I let others carry in my place. He extended his hand, and the baskets were placed at Ior's feet, the goats as well. Then he reached into his robe and took out a heavy necklace made of lion teeth and rare stones, the symbol of leadership, and laid it atop the offerings. I have nothing more to give than this, he said. Dotao looked at it all, then looked at Nzinga, then at the people. Her silence lasted longer than expected, and then she spoke. You cannot buy a wounded womb, not with goats, not with gold, not with late tears. Her words were like arrows. Not violent, but precise. This child doesn't need your inheritance. He needs clean roots. She bent down, picked up the necklace of leadership, held it high before the crowd, and then set it back down on the ground. Not returned, not reclaimed. It was a gesture that said, it's not enough to lay down a crown, you must learn to live without it. Mbe said nothing. He knew no words could undo what had been lived. Montu stepped forward. His gaze was calm but firm. What made you king was not your crown, it was the people's fear, and today they fear you no more. There were no cheers, no, the people remained in silence. But in that silence there was justice, there was understanding, there was weight. Mbe lowered his gaze, and without another word turned and walked away. The goats stayed, the coins too, but no one touched any of it. It was not reparation, it was just remains. All walked to the village fire, took a handful of earth and cast it over the baskets. Then she said, true justice is not made through trade, it is made through memory. And in that moment, everyone understood that forgiveness sometimes is not acceptance. It is release, that to refuse an apology can be paradoxically the only true form of forgiveness. Not for the other, but for himself. The past was not erased, but it was crossed, and in the village's history, that day would be remembered as the moment when truth stepped into the square and did not need to shout to be heard. After everything, the people expected Montu to return to the forest. They expected him, as always, to disappear into the mist of the early morning, carrying with him the silence and the pain he had learned to bear alone. But this time, Mont stayed, not out of pride, nor for recognition. He stayed because there was still something left to do. Something not even the elders dared to ask for, but which the eyes of the village silently pleaded. He chose the riverbank, a forgotten patch of land between stones and shadows, the same place where once he had wept for his dead wife and buried his lost child. Now that ground, once marked by farewells, would begin to tell a new story with hands covered in mud and bare feet. Montu raised a hut, not just any house, but a space made from everything he never had. Shelter. The walls were shaped with clay and goat's milk, an old mix used in times of scarcity, but also of hope. Every wall had a story. Each beam was an act of forgiveness. He offered the world, expecting nothing in return. The news spread quickly. The house he built soon became known as the Mid-River House, where no woman would be rejected for her pain, and no child would be called a bastard. There, No one asked where you came from, only where you wanted to go. The first to arrive were 3 silent women, one pregnant, another with a face marked by blows, and a third with a gaze that no longer knew how to trust. Montu welcomed them with bread and silence. Io took care of their healing, brewed teas, washed wounds, and above all listened. Enzing I grew up there, ran among the stones, learned the names of leaves, the songs of birds. He was curious and attentive. He listened to Montu's stories and would ask, "Is that our story too?" And Mu would answer, "It belongs to anyone brave enough to listen with their heart." Soon the villagers' youth began visiting the hut, not as onlookers but as learners. They came to hear Mantu speak of invisible scars, of truths time tries to bury, and of the courage that is born in silence. Elder Akaya would say that the place had become a temple not of prayer, but of remembrance. Ao in turn became a guide among the women. She was the healer who didn't sell medicine but offered soul. Her hands knew how to touch where pain hid. Her gaze said, "I've been on the ground too." Manu never stood on stages, never accepted posts, never sought titles. When invited to speak at the harvest festival, he preferred to sit among the farmers, share the same porridge, tell the same old joke. When the elders offered him a new leadership necklace, he declined. He sighed, "Leadership that's real doesn't need ornaments." The hut grew. It gained annexes gardens, a small space for children to learn to read and count. But what drew the most attention was the bench under the fig tree, where every afternoon Montu would sit with Enzinger on his lap, telling stories no one ever wrote down, but everyone remembered. Once a woman arrived from another village, dirty, hungry, with a little girl by the hand. Montu didn't ask anything. He handed her some porridge, pulled out another mat, and said, "The fire's lit. Sit. Life restarts here without hurry." And life truly did begin again there. Not with grand gestures, but with small daily reparations. A loaf shared, assilence respected, a name remembered, a glance unjudged. The house built with mud, milk, and memory became more than a refuge. It became a symbol that love doesn't need blood to be real. That justice, when born of the heart, doesn't impose, it offers. That sometimes salvation doesn't come from above, but from a man who, though wounded, chose to stay and to build right where everyone expected him to run. Time passed unhurriedly. In the village, the seasons continued their cycle. The cornfields grew tall. The rains came and went, the birds migrated and returned, but there was something different in the air, as if the soul of the place had been washed clean by true tears and healed by hands that sought no glory. The change wasn't immediate. It was slow, like the sprouting of a forgotten seed buried deep in the earth. But it came. Io, now recognized as the keeper of ancient knowledge and recent pain, continued to care for both bodies and souls. She was respected as a healer, but never placed herself above anyone. Her gaze, once evasive, now met the eyes of other women with steadiness. She had become a mother to all who needed to be children again. Her name, once feared or silenced, was now spoken with pride by children who grew up hearing her stories under the fig tree's shade. And Zinga, in turn, was no longer just the boy with the mark. He grew up among the songs of the women who had been welcomed among Mantis words, the scent of burning firewood, and the footsteps of newcomers. He became an agile youth, sharper, who understood more of human pain than many grown men. At the harvest festival, now grown, he appeared wearing a tunic sewn from scraps of fabric from the 3 tribes that had once been rivals, a cloth stitched by women's hands embroidered with symbols of reconciliation. When he danced in the village square, it wasn't out of vanity. It was for remembrance. At that same festival, the people wanted to honor Montu. They prepared a simple stage decorated with leaves and clay beads, but as always he refused to climb it. "I already have a seat," he said, and returned to the bench under the fig tree where he watched everything from afar, with the peace of someone who doesn't need to be seen to know he did what was right. Do Mbay. The former chief had left the village months earlier. He wasn't expelled. He simply realized there was no place left for him there. He left with few belongings. No one followed. His departure wasn't celebrated. It was mourned. The kind of mourning not danced but respected, because even a mistake when acknowledged teaches something. At the mid-river hut the fire continued to be lit every night. New women arrived, children were born, and stories were told slowly. Montu still woke early, still hunted now and then, still sat beside Ao at dusk. But now there was no pain in his movements, only purpose. One day, a young woman asked him, "Why did you never really leave?" He smiled faintly, ran his hand across the clay wall, and replied, "Because it was here that God sent justice to be born." And with that phrase, everything went quiet. Because there was something in that place, something between the stones. The branches of the fig tree, the eyes of Io, and the footsteps of Nzinga that said without needing to say, "Justice when it comes does not shout." It is born in the middle of the forest, in the midst of pain, in the heart of someone who chose not to grow hard. And that's why this story doesn't end with applause or medals. It ends as it began, with silence, with truth, and with the echo of a gesture that changed everything. Dot. In the forest, he once hid, but it was there that God sent justice to be born. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our